Tonight we dive into the harsh, the uncertain, and the less glorious aspects of the medieval era. You may imagine banquets and flags. Most days were simply about surviving until dawn. Fall in right now. Your very first evening would be a challenge. So before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what hour it is where you are. It's always intriguing to discover who's joining us from across the globe. Now, lower the lights and let's begin tonight's adventure together. To grasp this era, you must first abandon the clock, abandon the salaried job, the weekend, the entire concept of a life separate from the land. For more than 9 out of every 10 people in medieval Europe, existence was a tale written not in pen, but in earth. It was a rhythm, merciless and demanding, controlled by the gradual shift of the seasons and the persistent tolling of a far-off church bell. Picture the terrain of, perhaps, 12th century England or northern France. It is not a wild, untouched wilderness, but a carefully controlled, deeply human-altered landscape. The centre of this existence is the manor, an estate ruled by a lord, a baron, a bishop, an abbot. It barely matters, and the village that attaches to it like a barnacle to stone. Here existence is structured around the great open fields, enormous unfenced stretches of farmable land, which from above would appear like an enormous patchwork blanket. These fields were not possessed by the people who cultivate them. They were the lord's, and they were farmed following a system of remarkable inefficiency and strict custom. Each peasant household was assigned a number of strips or celians spread across the different fields. A man might have a strip here beside the lord's own land, another half a mile distant next to the swamp, and a third beyond the ridge. This was not accidental. It was a rough form of equality, guaranteeing that everyone received a mixture of fertile and poor earth. But the planning was a headache. So much time was lost simply travelling from one narrow ribbon of ground to another, hauling the few valuable tools one might possess. And possess is a generous term. The tools themselves were wonders of simplicity and spine-breaking work. The most crucial was the heavy plough, the karuka, with its iron coulter to slice the turf and its mouldboard to flip it over. This was a groundbreaking piece of technology. But it was costly, heavy, and needed a team of 8 oxen to drag it through the thick, clay-rich earth of northern Europe. No single peasant could afford such a team, so they pooled their resources, yoking their 1 or 2 animals with those of their neighbours, a forced cooperation that tied the village together in a web of shared obligation and bubbling resentment. For everything else there was wood and a little iron, the sickle for harvesting grain, its curved blade forcing the harvester to bend low, their back crying in protest for weeks on end. The scythe with its long, sweeping blade was used for hay, a quicker but less accurate tool. And then there was the flail for threshing, the simple spade, the hoe. Existence was an endless sequence of bending, lifting, pulling and pushing. And the calendar was God. In the cold, wet darkness of late autumn, after the harvest was in, the fields were ploughed. This was ploughing for the winter wheat and rye, a bleak, muddy task under grey skies. Winter was a time of hunkering down, of repairing tools, feeding the valuable livestock, and hoping the stores would last. It was a season of hunger and darkness. Then, as the first hints of spring broke the frost, the second ploughing began, preparing the land for the spring crops of oats, barley and beans. The 3-field system, an innovation that spread across much of Europe by the 11th century, was a stroke of agricultural brilliance. 1 field for winter crops, 1 for spring crops, and 1 left fallow to recover its nutrients. It increased the yield, provided a buffer against the failure of one season's crop, and allowed for the cultivation of oats, the primary fuel for the horse, which was slowly beginning to replace the plodding ox. But this system, this entire existence was built on a foundation of bondage. The majority of the peasants, the villeins or serfs, were tied to the land. They were not property in the way a Roman slave was. They could not be sold off the manor, but their lives were not their own. They owed their lord labour. This was the core of the manorial contract. For perhaps 3 days a week, a peasant had to perform week work, toiling not on his own scattered strips, but on the lord's domain, the portion of the land whose entire produce went directly to the manor house. All that effort, all that sweat for someone else's benefit. Then there was boon work. Extra days required during the busiest times of the year, like the harvest, when every able-bodied person was needed in the fields from before dawn until after dusk. Missing this work was not an option, and on top of the labour came the payments, a a cascade of obligations designed to extract from the peasant at every turn. To grind his grain into flour, he had to use the Lord's mill and pay a portion of the flour as a fee, the multure. To bake his bread, he had to use the Lord's oven. To press his apples, the Lord's cider press. These were monopolies, inescapable and enforced. There were taxes in kind. A chicken at Christmas, eggs at Easter, and there were taxes that struck at the very heart of a family's existence. If a peasant's daughter wished to marry someone from outside the manor, the Lord had to grant permission, and a fee the merchant had to be paid. It was a tax on her movement, a reminder that she was part of the manor's human livestock. When the head of the household died, the Lord claimed the best animal as an inheritance tax, the Harriet. Imagine the grief of a family already facing the loss of its primary worker, watching the Lord's reeve lead away their only ox, the key to their future survival. This was a life lived on the edge, a life of perpetual grinding toil with little hope of advancement. The social structure was as rigid and unyielding as the frozen winter earth. You were born into your station. The son of a villain would be a villain. His world was small, often no larger than the few miles he might walk in his entire lifetime. He knew the shape of every tree on the path to the fields, the smell of the Lord's stables, the sound of the mill wheel turning. He was governed by custom, by the reeve who oversaw the daily work, and by the manorial court that settled disputes over wandering pigs or poorly maintained fences. It was a society of immense intimacy and absolutely no privacy. Everyone knew everyone else's business. And above all, there was the sense of permanence, the belief that this was the way things were, the way they had always been, and the way they would always be, a divinely ordained order of those who pray, those who fight, and making up the vast silent majority, those who work. The mud from the fields was a constant companion, caked onto wooden patterns, staining the hem of a rough woolen tunic. It was carried from the furrows into the village, into the very home where it mingled with the debris of life in a world that had not yet conceived of the germ. The peasant's hut. The cots of the village were not idyllic country cottages. They were dark, cramped, and profoundly unsanitary. A typical dwelling was a 1 or 2 room structure built of wattle and daub, a framework of woven sticks packed with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, and topped with a thatched roof that was a haven for vermin and prone to catching fire. There was no floor, just the trodden earth, which over time became a compacted layer of dirt, food scraps, and spilled drink. Windows were small, unglazed slits covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth that let in a little light, but kept out most of the air. A central hearth provided the only heat and light, but with no chimney. The smoke filled the small space, stinging the eyes and coating every surface with a layer of soot. It was a perpetual twilight, thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and damp. Often the family's precious livestock, a pig, a few chickens, perhaps even the cow in the dead of winter, would be brought inside at night to protect them from theft and the cold. The warmth was welcome. The filth was simply part of the package. Human and animal waste mingled freely on the packed earth floor. This intimate squalor was replicated on a larger scale outside. The village street was a mire of mud, animal droppings, and household waste. There were no sewers, no organized rubbish collection. People simply threw their trash known as midden out the door where it accumulated in stinking piles. Pigs, the ubiquitous medieval garbage disposal units, roamed freely, rooting through the filth. The village well or stream, the source of all drinking water, was often frighteningly close to the churchyard where the dead were buried in shallow graves or downhill from the cesspits and dung heaps. No one understood the connection between contaminated water and diseases like dysentery or typhoid. Sickness was a mystery, a matter of divine will or malevolent forces. It was blamed on miasma, the theory that disease was spread by bad air, foul smells emanating from swamps, decaying matter, or even the alignment of the planets. While not entirely wrong, foul smells often do indicate the presence of bacteria. It missed the true culprit, the invisible world of microbes. So the medieval response to an outbreak was not to clean the water, but to burn fragrant herbs, to ring church bells to break up the poisoned air, or most commonly, to pray. If this was the reality for a village, the town was a concentrated, amplified version of the same chaos. By the 14th century, cities like London and Paris were growing rapidly, their populations swelling within ancient Roman walls that were never designed for such numbers. The streets were narrow, winding alleys, unpaved and perpetually shadowed by jettied upper stories that leaned out over the path. Nearly touching in some places, the only drainage was a central gutter or kennel, which was supposed to carry rainwater away. In practice, it was a stagnant channel for every kind of refuse imaginable. Butchers slaughtered animals in the street, letting the blood and offal run into the kennel. Tanners scraped hides, releasing noxious chemicals and bits of rotting flesh. Dyers poured used dyes into the gutter, and from the windows above, a constant shower of waste. Housewives would empty their chamber pots with a cry of "Garde l'eau," watch out for the water, giving the unfortunate passerby a moment's notice to scurry away. The sheer accumulation of filth was staggering. In 1321, King Edward II of England famously complained about the conditions in London, lamenting the abominable and most filthy stench arising from the streets. Royal proclamations were made. Ordinances were passed in Paris. Philip II ordered the main thoroughfares to be paved in 1186. In London, rakers were hired to cart away the worst of the public filth to dumps outside the city walls. But these efforts were piecemeal, underfunded, and fighting a losing battle against the daily output of tens of thousands of people's cesspits in the backyards, of houses frequently overflowed into neighbouring properties or leached into the shallow wells from which people drew their water. The River Thames, the main artery of London, was both the primary source of drinking water and the city's largest open sewer. Its tributary, the Fleet River, was so clogged with waste from latrines, slaughterhouses, and tanneries that it was described in the 1350s as a sluggish, black, stinking ditch. Personal hygiene was a complicated affair, not quite the non-existent caricature it's often made out to be, but a world away from modern standards. The wealthy might have a wooden tub for a bath, a luxury enjoyed with perfumed water, but for the common person, a full body wash was a rare event. Soap made from animal fat and lye was a harsh caustic substance, used more for laundry than for bodies. People washed their hands and faces, certainly often from a basin of water in the morning. But the lack of clean running water, the sheer effort involved in heating it over a fire, and a cultural belief that excessive bathing, particularly in the winter, could open the pores and let in disease meant that standards were low. Clothes were rarely washed and were often infested with lice and fleas, which were an accepted, if annoying, part of life. These insects were not just a nuisance, they were vectors for disease. The common flea, after biting an infected rat, could transmit the bubonic plague. The body louse could spread typhus. In this unclean world, disease was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant lurking presence, a predator that thrived in the squalor, waiting for a population weakened by a diet that was as monotonous as it was precarious. And the water used for that occasional washing for that rare bit of laundry was the same water used for cooking. It was scooped from the river or drawn from the well and poured into the great iron pot that hung over the fire, the centerpiece of the medieval kitchen and the source of nearly every meal. Into this pot went the foundation of the medieval diet, grains, not the refined white flour of the Lord's table, but the coarse dark flour of rye, barley or oats. This was boiled with water or thin ale to create a pottage, a thick porridge-like stew that was the daily bread, literally of the vast majority. It was the medieval equivalent of fuel. It was bland, it was filling and dull, and it was eaten day after day, year after year. To this greyish mush might be added whatever was available from the small garden plot, the toft that adjoined the peasant's hovel. Peas and beans were staples dried and stored for the winter, providing a crucial source of protein. In the summer there might be onions, leeks, cabbage and turnips. Seasoning was minimal, perhaps some herbs from the garden. Salt was expensive. Pepper and other spices were the stuff of fantasy, luxuries from the East that cost more than a peasant might see in a year. Meat was a rarity. The great forests were the Lord's hunting grounds, and poaching a deer was an offence punishable by mutilation or death. The peasant's own livestock was too valuable to be eaten regularly. An ox was a tractor. A cow provided milk which could be turned into a simple sour cheese or a little butter. Chickens provided eggs. These animals were living assets. They would be slaughtered only when they were old and tough, or for a special feast day. The most common source of meat for the poor was the pig, that self-sufficient forager which could be slaughtered in the autumn and its meat salted, smoked, and cured to last through the lean months of winter. Every part of the pig was used. Nothing was wasted. The result of this grain-heavy, monotonous diet was chronic malnutrition. It was not necessarily a diet of starvation, but one of profound nutritional deficiency. The lack of vitamin C, especially during the long winters when fresh greens were unavailable, led to scurvy with its symptoms of rotting gums, loose teeth, and internal bleeding. A deficiency of vitamin D from a lack of sunlight and certain foods caused rickets in children, resulting in bowed legs and deformed skeletons that are still visible in the archaeological record. Iron deficiency led to anemia, a constant state of exhaustion and weakness. This constant low-level malnutrition had a devastating cumulative effect. It stunted growth, it made people tired and inefficient workers, and most critically, it weakened their immune systems, leaving them exquisitely vulnerable to the diseases that fed in the unclean world around them. A simple infection that a well-nourished person might fight off could prove fatal. A bout of dysentery that bloody flux picked up from contaminated water was far more likely to kill a person whose body was already struggling. This delicate balance between subsistence and sickness could be shattered at any moment by the ultimate medieval terror, famine. The entire agricultural system, for all its intricate rules and rhythms, was utterly dependent on the weather. One wet summer, one late spring frost, one hailstorm at the wrong time could decimate the harvest. The peasant family lived with a razor-thin margin of safety. They were expected to set aside their seed for the next year's planting from their own harvest, and then pay their tithe to the church and their various dues to the Lord. What was left was for them to eat. If the harvest was even 10 or 20% below normal, they faced dire straits, a period of scarcity and hunger. If it failed catastrophically, they faced famine. And in the early 14th century, it failed on a scale that Europe had never seen before. The period began with the onset of what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, a cooling trend that brought colder, wetter, and more unpredictable weather. The year 1315 began with a deluge. From the spring onwards, it rained and rained and rained. Across northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland, the fields turned to lakes. The seeds rotted in the ground. The harvest was a disaster. The price of grain began to climb slowly at first, and then with terrifying speed. What little surplus existed was hoarded by lords and merchants. By the spring of 1316, the price of wheat in England had quadrupled. People began to eat the seed grain they had saved for planting, a desperate act of consuming the future to survive the present. They ate their livestock. They ate cats, dogs, and rats. They ate the bark from trees and the leaves from bushes. The chronicles of the time, like that of the English monk John of Trocolo, paint a harrowing picture. He writes of the poor eating their own children, of thieves in dungeons tearing apart and devouring new prisoners. These are horror stories, perhaps exaggerated, but they speak to a society pushed to the absolute brink of collapse. The social order frayed. Lawlessness became rampant as starving bands roamed the countryside, taking what they could. The Great Famine, as it came to be known, lasted until the harvest of 1317, and its effects lingered for years. Disease followed in its wake as typhus and other pestilences swept through the weakened, starving populations. It's estimated that in some parts of Europe, 10 to 15% of the population perished. It was a demographic catastrophe, a brutal continent-wide lesson in the fragility of a world built on a single vulnerable harvest. It was a stark reminder that for the vast majority of people, life was a desperate struggle on three fronts: the endless toil in the fields, the omnipresent filth and disease that surrounded them, and the gnawing uncertainty of the next meal. It was a cycle of labor, sickness, and hunger. Precarious existence where survival itself was the only real victory. The first great trial of a medieval life was simply to begin it. The act of birth, a moment we now cocoon in sterile light and medical precision, was then a perilous passage through a shadowed valley, undertaken in the home, in the very bed where life was conceived, and where all too often it would end. Imagine a small, dark room, the air thick with the smoke of a peat fire and the scent of sweat, herbs, and fear. Light filters poorly through a single unglazed window, covered by a wooden shutter or a piece of oiled linen. This is the birthing chamber, a space reclaimed entirely by women. No male physician would be present. The mysteries of childbirth were the exclusive domain of the midwife and a supporting cast of female relatives and neighbours. The midwife, or obstetrix, was a figure of immense local importance. Her skills passed down through generations, a mixture of practical experience, herbal lore, and deeply ingrained tradition. She might be a comforting presence, her hands calloused but sure, her voice a low murmur of encouragement and prayer, or she could be a harbinger of doom, her methods rooted in folklore that could do more harm than good. The process was a communal ordeal. The laboring mother, often no more than a girl herself, would be encouraged to walk, to lean, to squat, using a birthing stool if her family was prosperous enough to own one. She might be given potions to hasten the delivery, pepper to induce sneezing, the dung of a white dog mixed with wine, or a broth made from a mother's own milk. They would tie eagle stones to her thigh, believing the hollow geodes with their rattling pebbles could coax the infant out. The room would be a hive of activity. Water was heated, linens were gathered, prayers were offered to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, whose own legend involved being swallowed and then regurgitated by a dragon, an uncomfortably apt metaphor for a difficult birth. The air of quiet desperation grew with every passing hour. Every birth was a gamble with the odds stacked cruelly against both mother and child. We must understand the scale of the danger. Before the advent of antiseptics, before the understanding of germ theory, the simplest complication could be a death sentence. The hands of the midwife were unwashed. The cloths used were not sterile. Infection, the dreaded childbed fever or puerperal sepsis was a ghost that haunted every delivery. An invisible predator that could claim the new mother days or even weeks later, leaving behind a bewildered husband and a wailing motherless infant. For the woman, the risks were legion. Hemorrhage from which she could not be saved. Obstructed labor that could last for days, leading to exhaustion and death, or the tearing of tissues that would result in a lifetime of pain and incontinence. A private suffering endured in a world with no remedy for it. Historians estimate that for every 40 births, one mother died. It does not sound like a staggering number until you consider that a woman might endure 10 or more pregnancies in her lifetime. Her chances of surviving to old age diminished with each child she bore. She was in essence playing a game of Russian roulette with each pregnancy, a biological duty that was also the single greatest threat to her existence. And for the infant, the journey was even more fraught. The trauma of a prolonged difficult birth could be fatal. A breech presentation where the baby was positioned feet first was almost always a death sentence for the child and often for the mother, as the midwife's only recourse was often a brutal procedure known as embryotomy, using hooks and knives to dismember the fetus in the womb to save the mother's life. If the child survived the passage into the world, it arrived in a state of profound vulnerability. There was no understanding of neonatal care. The umbilical cord would be cut with a domestic knife and often dressed with soot, cow dung, or chewed herbs, a direct invitation to tetanus. The numbers are difficult to absorb from our modern vantage point. Across medieval Europe, it is estimated that between a quarter and a third of all infants die before their first birthday. Think of that. Of every 3 cradles rocked in a village, 1 would fall silent within the year. Another great culling would occur before the age of 5, with diseases we now prevent with a simple vaccine. Measles, diphtheria, smallpox, whooping cough, scything through the population of children. In total, nearly half of all people born in the Middle Ages would not live to see their 10th birthday. This was not a rare tragedy. It was the wallpaper of life, the expected ambient sorrow of existence. Parents loved their children, of course, but a certain emotional distance was a necessary shield against the inevitable losses. They often delayed naming a child for days or weeks, waiting to see if it would stick. If a baby was born weak or seemed unlikely to survive, the first priority was not medicine, but theology. The paramount concern was the infant's immortal soul. An unbaptized child who died was, according to mainstream doctrine, barred from heaven, consigned to limbo for eternity. This spiritual terror prompted the emergency baptism, a frantic race against the fading breath of a newborn. The midwife herself was often empowered by the church to perform the rite if a priest could not be found in time. She would sprinkle whatever water was at hand onto the baby's head, intoning the crucial words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." In some horrifying cases where a baby was trapped in the birth canal and death was certain, a special syringe-like device was even used to squirt holy water into the womb itself, a desperate last-ditch effort to save a soul that could not be saved in body. For the infants who survived these first treacherous hours and days, the world remained a hostile place. They would be tightly swaddled, wrapped in long linen bands from neck to toe, immobilizing their limbs. This practice, which seems cruel to us, was born of the belief that an infant's limbs were soft and pliable like wax and would grow crooked if not bound straight. It also made the baby easier to manage to hang from a peg on the wall or lay in a corner while the mother returned to her endless labors. The child became a neat, quiet little bundle, too quiet sometimes. Many a swaddled infant laid by the hearth for warmth rolled into the embers. Many more sharing a bed with exhausted parents and siblings were accidentally suffocated in the night. A tragedy so common it was given a name, overlaying. Feeding was another hurdle. While breastfeeding was the norm, if a mother died in childbirth or was too ill to produce milk, the only hope was a wet nurse. For a wealthy family, this was a simple transaction. A woman, often one who had recently lost her own infant, would be brought into the household. For the poor, it was a far more desperate affair, a choice between the prohibitive cost of a wet nurse and attempting to raise the child by hand. This usually meant feeding it pap, a thin gruel of bread or flour mixed with water or milk, fed from a horn or a cloth-wrapped spoon. A poor substitute for the nutrients and antibodies of breast milk and a perfect medium for bacteria. The life of a motherless infant was almost always a short one. The struggle for survival was constant, a quiet daily war waged against a world of invisible threats. And the chief weapon in this war, the medical theory that guided all action, was a magnificent, comprehensive, and catastrophically wrong system of belief. When the newborn child fell into a fever, or the mother languished with an infection, or a farmer felt a pain deep in his chest, the response was governed not by what could be seen, but by a theory of what was unseen. This was the doctrine of the four humours, a medical framework of such intellectual elegance and intuitive power that it held the Western world in its grip for over 1,500 years. It was not medieval in origin. Its roots lay in the sun-drenched intellectual world of ancient Greece, with Hippocrates in the 5th century BC. But it was a Roman physician of the 2nd century AD, Galen of Pergamon, who synthesized and codified it into an unassailable medical Bible. Galen's writings preserved and translated by Arabic scholars, and later rediscovered by the West form the absolute bedrock of medical education in the great universities of Salerno, Montpellier, Oxford, and Bologna. To question Galen was to question reason itself. The theory was beautifully simple, a perfect microcosm of the universe. The human body, it was believed, was composed of 4 fundamental fluids or humours. Each humour was linked to one of the 4 elements that made up the entire cosmos: earth, air, fire, and water. First, there was blood associated with the element of air. It was considered hot and moist, and it produced a sanguine or cheerful and optimistic temperament. Then came phlegm associated with water. It was cold and moist, and an excess of it made a person phlegmatic, calm, and perhaps a bit listless. Third was yellow bile or choler linked to fire, hot and dry. It was responsible for a choleric temperament, fiery, ambitious, and easily angered. And finally, there was black bile or melancholy from the Greek melas chole, linked to the earth. It was cold and dry, and it produced the melancholic personality, thoughtful, introspective, and prone to sadness. Every individual was born with a unique innate balance of these 4 fluids. This balance, their complexion or temperament, determined their physical and psychological nature. A healthy person was one in whom the humours were in perfect equilibrium. Illness, therefore, was never seen as an invasion from the outside, not a germ or a virus, but always as an internal problem, a humoral imbalance. The body had either produced too much of one humour or was failing to expel a corrupt or peccant humour. The entire purpose of medicine, the sole task of the physician, was to identify the imbalance and help the body restore its natural equilibrium. It was a system of profound logic. It explained everything from a common cold, an excess of cold, moist phlegm, to a fit of rage, a surge of hot, dry, yellow bile. And how did a physician diagnose this imbalance? He would rarely touch the patient. The physical examination was a cursory affair at best. The primary diagnostic tools were far more refined, or so it was thought. The physician would meticulously examine the patient's urine, holding a special flask called a matula up to the light. He would scrutinize its color, its clarity, its sediment, and even its smell and taste, comparing it to elaborate charts that linked every possible shade of urine to a specific humoral condition. He would take the patient's pulse, not just to measure its speed, but to assess its quality. Was it a bounding pulse, a thready pulse, a worm-like pulse? He would also consult astrological charts for the movements of the planets and stars were believed to exert a powerful influence on the body and its humors. A diagnosis was a deeply intellectual exercise, a process of deduction based on these signs and the patient's own description of their feelings. Once the offending humor was identified, the treatment was obvious. The excess must be removed. This led directly to the cornerstone of medieval medical practice, depletion therapy. The body had to be drained, purged, and evacuated of the humor that was causing the trouble. If the patient suffered from a fever, a flushed face, and a racing pulse, the diagnosis was a surplus of hot, moist blood. The cure was bloodletting. This was not a fringe practice. It was the single most common medical procedure performed for centuries. It was considered a panacea prescribed for everything from headaches and pneumonia to insanity and heartbreak. There were several ways to go about it. The most common was venesection or phlebotomy. A physician, or more often a barber surgeon, a craftsman who combined the cutting of hair with minor surgery, would make an incision in a vein, typically on the inside of the elbow. The patient would be instructed to grip a staff to make the vein bulge, and the blood would be collected in a bowl, its quantity carefully measured. Phlebotomy charts, like grotesque roadmaps of the body, showed the specific points from which to bleed for specific ailments. A vein in the forehead for a headache, one in the ankle for a uterine problem. The amount of blood removed could be staggering pint after pint until the patient fainted, which was often taken as a sign that the treatment was working, that the body's corrupt excess had been purged. Another method was scarification, which involved making multiple shallow cuts with a special instrument followed by cupping. A heated glass or horn cup would be placed over the cuts, and as it cooled, the vacuum created would draw the blood out. And then there were the leeches. The medicinal leech Hirudo medicinalis was a living, breathing pharmaceutical. Apothecaries kept them in jars, and they would be applied to the patient's skin, where they would attach themselves and drink their fill of blood falling away when they were engorged. For ailments of the mouth, they would be placed directly on the gums. It was a tidy, if unsettling way to remove a specific, localized quantity of blood. But blood was only one of the four humors. If the problem was an excess of yellow or black bile, the cure was a purgative or an emetic designed to violently empty the digestive tract from one end or the other. Potent laxatives made from senna, rhubarb, or scammony would be administered to induce severe diarrhea. To make the patient vomit, doctors prescribed hellebore or potions of wine mixed with antimony. The goal was a dramatic physical expulsion of the sickness. The patient was a vessel that needed to be emptied. For an excess of phlegm believed to cause colds and respiratory problems, the treatment involved expectorants and diuretics, as well as prescribing foods considered hot and dry, like pepper, garlic, and red wine to counteract the cold and moist nature of the illness. Everything in the patient's life, their diet, their sleep, the very air they breathed was calibrated to this humoral scale. It was a total system, an all-encompassing way of seeing the body in the world. And it was, of course, provably and lethally wrong. The very treatments designed to cure were in fact weakening the patient, dehydrating them, and opening up new avenues for infection. The feverish patient, already losing fluids, was bled and purged, further depleting their body's ability to fight. They were in a very real sense being treated to death with the very best of intentions and the full weight of ancient authority. Armed with this flawed but internally consistent map of the human body, the people of the Middle Ages confronted a daily onslaught of sickness and injury. Long before the great terrifying spectre of the Black Death arrived to reshape the world, life was a low-grade chronic state of battle against a host of more mundane afflictions. It was a world without antibiotics, without anesthetics, without even a basic understanding of hygiene. And so the simplest of misfortunes could easily spiral into a life-threatening crisis. The background noise of medieval life was the sound of a cough, the groan of a painful joint, the quiet hiss of a fever. Consider the water. In the growing towns and cities, rivers were a convenient repository for all manner of waste from tanneries, from butcher shops, from the latrines of every household. Wells were often shallow and easily contaminated by cesspits. The result was a constant prevalence of waterborne disease. Dysentery, known grimly as the bloody flux, was a perennial killer, especially in summer and during military campaigns when large groups of people were crowded together in unsanitary conditions. It caused debilitating diarrhea, dehydration, and often death. Typhoid fever was another constant threat, spreading silently through contaminated food and water. These were diseases of the gut, and in the humoral system, they were often attributed to a choleric imbalance. The treatment was predictably grim purges and bleeding to remove the corrupt humours which only served to worsen the deadly dehydration. The air, too, was a source of peril. Without an understanding of virology, airborne illnesses like influenza, often called the sweat or grip, could sweep through a community with ferocious speed, leaving the old and the very young especially vulnerable. Pneumonia, which they might have called pleurisy or peripneumonia, was a common and often fatal complication of any respiratory illness. Tuberculosis or consumption was a slow-wasting disease that hollowed out its victims over months or years, a dreaded presence in damp, crowded homes. For these ailments of the lungs, thought to be caused by an excess of phlegm treatments focused on restoring warmth and dryness, patients were wrapped in wool, fed spicy foods, and given cough remedies made from herbs like horehound, coltsfoot, and licorice. They would inhale the steam from boiling concoctions of hyssop or thyme. These might have provided some symptomatic relief, but they were powerless against the underlying infection. Life was also physically hard, and injuries were commonplace. A farmer might fall and break a leg. A blacksmith could suffer a severe burn. A knight, even in a tournament, might sustain a wound that would be trivial today. The problem was not the injury itself, but what came after: infection. Any break in the skin was an open door for bacteria. A simple cut from a scythe could lead to a swollen, inflamed limb, the red lines of sepsis creeping up the skin. The wound would fester, filling with pus, which in a bizarre twist of Galenic logic was often seen as a good sign. Laudable pus, they called it, believing it was the body expelling its corrupt humours. Surgeons would even apply irritating poultices to encourage a clean wound to become infected, believing this was part of the healing process. Treatments for these wounds were a desperate mix of pragmatism and prayer. The wound might be washed with wine, one of the few effective antiseptics available, though its properties were not understood. Cobwebs, which we now know can have clotting and antibiotic properties, might be pressed into a cut to staunch the bleeding. Poultices of bread and milk or of dung and mouldy cheese would be applied to draw out the evil. If gangrene set in, the only option was amputation, a gruesome ordeal performed without anaesthetic by the barber surgeon. The patient, wide awake and held down by several strong men, would have to endure the sore. The stump would be cauterized with a red-hot iron, or plunged into boiling oil to stop the bleeding. The shock and subsequent infection killed as many as the procedure saved. Beyond these dramatic crises, there was the constant misery of lesser ailments. Skin diseases were rampant. Scabies caused by a burrowing mite created an unbearable itch. Erysipelas, a bacterial infection nicknamed St. Anthony's fire for the burning sensation it caused, could be fatal. Poor diet, especially during the winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce, led to vitamin deficiencies. Scurvy was not just a disease of sailors. It afflicted entire communities, causing bleeding gums, loose teeth, and lethargy. The constant gnawing pain of a rotten tooth was a universal experience for which the only real cure was extraction. This was performed not by a doctor, but by a tooth puller, often an itinerant showman at a fair who would use a terrifying-looking turnkey or pelican to wrench the tooth out to the sound of drums and trumpets meant to drown out the patient's screams. To combat this endless tide of sickness, people turned to a vast and varied pharmacopoeia of remedies, a rich tapestry woven from ancient learning, local folklore, Christian faith, and pure superstition. The local monastery often had a carefully tended herb garden, its monks preserving the botanical knowledge of classical writers like Dioscorides. They grew poppies from which they made opium-based painkillers, like laudanum belladonna or deadly nightshade for a muscle, relaxant and willow whose bark contained salicin, a natural precursor to aspirin. The village would also have its wise woman or cunning man, a lay healer whose knowledge of local plants was encyclopedic. They knew that a tea of yarrow could help reduce a fever, that a poultice of comfrey could help set a broken bone, that foxglove, used with extreme care, for it was also a deadly poison, could treat dropsy or congestive heart failure. This practical herbalism often blended seamlessly with magic. The effectiveness of a plant might be thought to depend on when it was gathered at midnight under a full moon, or on the incantations recited over it. This was also the world of the doctrine of signatures, a belief that God had benevolently marked plants to indicate their use. Thus, lungwort with its spotted leaves resembling a diseased lung was used for coughs. The toothwort root shaped like a molar was for toothache. Walnuts, with their resemblance to a tiny wrinkled brain, were prescribed for head ailments. And when herbal remedies failed, people turned to faith. Every ailment had its patron saint. You prayed to Saint Blaise for afflictions of the throat, to Saint Lucy for blindness, to Saint Apollonia for toothache, and to Saint Roch for the plague. A pilgrimage to a shrine containing the relics of a powerful saint was a common prescription. The sick would travel for days or weeks to touch the tomb of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, or to drink the water from the Holy Well at Walsingham, hoping for a miracle. They would buy lead badges as proof of their journey, pinning them to their hats. Sometimes the desperation led to more esoteric practices. Amulets were worn to ward off disease. Magical words were written on scraps of parchment and swallowed. Complex rituals were performed to transfer an illness from a person to an animal or a tree. For the medieval mind, there was no clear dividing line between the physical and the spiritual, between medicine and magic. A fever could be caused by an excess of blood, but it could also be caused by a demon or by the malevolent curse of a witch. The treatment, therefore, had to address all possibilities, and so the patient might be bled by a surgeon, given a herbal concoction by a wise woman, and have a priest say a mass for their recovery, all for the very same illness. It was a multi-pronged assault on an enemy that was everywhere all the time, an enemy they could feel but could not see and could not for all their efforts truly understand. Before the great and sudden calamities that would define the 14th century, there was a slower, more personal terror, a creeping dread that could single out a man, a woman, a child, and erase them from the world of the living long before they had died. It was a fear that walked on two legs, a fear announced by the hollow clack of a wooden clapper or the sad insistent ring of a small bell. This was the world of the leper, the world of what they called lepra. We now know it as Hansen's disease, a bacteriological infection slow-growing and in its early stages entirely curable with modern medicine. But in the medieval mind, it was something far more profound. It was a sign, a physical manifestation of spiritual impurity, a divine judgment made flesh. The diagnosis was rarely a precise medical affair. It was a social and religious verdict. When whispers started in a village about a neighbour's strange skin lesions, the thickening of their facial features, the loss of sensation in their hands or feet, a process would begin. The accused would be brought before a panel, often a local priest, perhaps a town official, maybe someone from the local barber surgeons guild who fancied himself a physician. They would look for the telltale signs, the facies leonina, the lion-like face with its deeply grooved swollen features. They would poke and prod at numb patches of skin, watching for the lack of reaction. Anesthesia, the inability to feel pain, was one of its most cruel and paradoxical symptoms. The very thing that might seem a blessing was in fact the disease's most destructive tool, allowing for injuries to go unnoticed, to fester, to lead to the slow, painless loss of fingers, toes, and entire limbs through secondary infection and trauma. Once the verdict was delivered, the world of the afflicted individual shrank to nothing. They were subjected to a ceremony of profound and chilling symbolism, the separatio leprorum, the Mass of the Separation. The ritual was designed to mirror a funeral, for in the eyes of the law and the church, the leper was now dead. They would enter the church, often veiled, and stand in a specially cordoned area, sometimes beside an open grave dug in the churchyard. The priest would conduct a full requiem mass. The leper would hear the funeral chant sung for their own soul. After the mass, they would be led outside to the grave, and the priest would take a spade of earth and sprinkle it over their head, reciting the solemn words, Sis mortuus mundo, vivens iterum Deo, be dead to the world, but alive again to God. From that moment on, their old life was gone. They were forbidden to enter a church, a mill, a bakehouse, or a tavern. They could not touch healthy people or eat with them. They could not walk on narrow paths. They had to stand downwind of anyone they spoke to. To enforce this, they were given a uniform of their new existence, usually a grey or black hooded cloak, and always the warning device. In some parts of France, it was a clapper, 2 or 3 pieces of wood that made a dry, rattling sound. In England and Germany, it was more often a bell. The sound was a command, unclean make way. It was the soundtrack of their social death. Their home was no longer their own. They were exiled to a place built specifically for them, a place on the margins of society, quite literally. Just outside the town walls, often downwind and near a crossroads, stood the leprosarium, the leper house. And these were not prisons precisely, but they were a form of permanent quarantine. Some were squalid hovels funded by meagre charity. Others, however, were surprisingly well-organized and well-funded institutions run by monastic orders. The most famous of these was the Military and Hospitaller Order of St. Lazarus of Jerusalem, an order that not only cared for lepers, but was for a time led by them. A knight of the order who contracted leprosy could, in a strange inversion of fortune, rise to become its grandmaster. Life within the leprosarium was a microcosm of the world outside, but a warped reflection. They had their own chapels, their own gardens, their own rules. They were communities of the dead to the world. Here the social stigma was removed, for everyone bore the same cross. But the disease itself was relentless. Its progress was measured in years, even decades. It was a slow, patient dismantling of the human body. Nerves in the hands and feet would die, leading to muscle wastage and the characteristic clawed hands. The disease could attack the eyes, causing blindness. It could invade the throat, reducing the voice to a rasping whisper. And all the while, the physical deformities would worsen the face, becoming a mask of its former self. Yet contrary to popular myth, the disease was not highly contagious. It required prolonged close contact to spread, a fact utterly unknown at the time. The fear it generated was wildly disproportionate to its actual transmissibility. It was the symbolism that was so potent. In a world obsessed with salvation and damnation, the leper was a walking sermon on sin, a terrifying reminder of what could happen when God's favour was withdrawn. For every one leper cast out, 1,000 others were reminded to be pious, to be charitable, and to be grateful that the clapper and the bell were not for them. This slow, individual decay was a familiar horror, a thread woven into the fabric of daily life. But the world was on the cusp of a new kind of horror, one that would not single out individuals, but would instead attempt to swallow society whole. The sky was about to change. The process began subtly, not with a sickness in the flesh of man, but a sickness in the heavens. The period historians now call the medieval warm period, a few centuries of relatively mild, stable weather that had allowed the population of Europe to boom, was coming to a close. The climate was shifting, becoming colder, wetter, more erratic, and in the spring of 1315 it began to rain. It wasn't a series of dramatic thunderstorms. It was worse. It was a persistent, grim, unending deluge that settled over northern Europe. From the Pyrenees to the steppes of Russia, from Ireland to Italy, the chronicles of the time are filled with bewildered despair. The sky, it seemed, was weeping without end. Through the spring and into the summer, it rained and rained. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic, a cascade of agricultural collapse. The newly ploughed fields, sown with the precious seed grain that was supposed to provide the year's harvest, turned into vast plains of mud. The seeds simply rotted in the soil. The hay cut for animal fodder couldn't be dried. It lay in sodden, blackening heaps in the fields. Grain that was harvested had such high moisture content, it couldn't be properly milled, and quickly grew mold in the coastal areas. The constant storms and rising sea levels overwhelmed the salt pans, creating a critical shortage of the one substance, essential for preserving what little meat was available. The entire food production and preservation system, a delicate balance honed over centuries, was unraveling in a single season. By the autumn of 1315, the shortages were becoming acute. The price of wheat, the staple food for the vast majority of the population, began to skyrocket in England. It octupled from its normal level, rising to 8 times what an average family could afford. The granaries of lords and monasteries, normally full, were emptying at an alarming rate. King Edward II of England, a man not known for his sharp grasp of logistics, was travelling through St. Albans in August and found that he and his queen could not even buy bread for their court. It was a stark, humiliating sign of a system breaking down from the top to the very bottom. The winter of 1315 was a grim affair of scraping by, of eating seed grain meant for the next planting, a desperate mortgage against a future that was looking increasingly bleak. And then the spring of 1316 arrived, and with it the rain returned. It was a replay of the previous year, but this time the population was already weakened, the reserves already gone. Now starvation set in on a continental scale. This was not mere hunger. This was famine, the kind of famine that alters societies. Chroniclers like the Flemish astronomer Simon de Corvino wrote of the gaunt, skeletal figures wandering the countryside, their bellies swollen from edema, their skin pale, their eyes hollow. They ate anything they could find. They ate dogs, cats, rats. They stripped the bark from trees and dug for roots in the forest. They boiled leather and old shoes to create a semblance of broth. The social order already strained began to fracture. The bonds of community and kinship so central to medieval life were shredded by desperation. Crime soared. It wasn't organized banditry so much as the desperate, violent acts of starving neighbors. Warehouses were raided. Travelers were ambushed for the crust of bread in their satchel. The old and the sick were the first to die, their meager rations taken by the stronger. Peasants unable to pay their rents or feed their families abandoned their ancestral lands on the manors, fleeing to the cities in the vain hope of finding food, only to find the same desperation there, but concentrated and filthier. They died in the streets and in the alleyways, their bodies left unburied for days. And then came the final unthinkable taboo. As the chronicler John of Trocoloe recorded with horror, cannibalism became a reality. Reports too numerous to be mere rumour spoke of travellers being murdered for their flesh, of children being lured away and killed. In Ireland and parts of Germany, there were accounts of starving people digging up the newly buried dead for food. There is even a grim tale from Gloucester of prisoners in the local jail, so starved that they fell upon and devoured any new inmates brought into their cells. This was the complete dissolution of the moral order. The Great Famine, as it would come to be known, raged for 2.5 years. The rain finally abated in the summer of 1317, allowing for a successful harvest. But the damage was done. The scale of the death was almost unimaginable. Modern estimates suggest that in many parts of Northern Europe, between 10 and 25% of the population perished. That's millions of people. It was a demographic catastrophe that dwarfed any war. Entire villages were wiped out. The continent's population growth, which had been steady for centuries, was not just halted. It was thrown violently into reverse. The famine left deep scars on the generation that survived it. They were physically weakened, their immune systems compromised by years of chronic malnutrition. They were psychologically scarred by the horrors they had witnessed, and in some cases, participated in the faith in institutions in the ability to provide order in the church to provide solace and divine intercession was shaken. God, it seemed, turned his face away, first punishing individuals with the slow decay of leprosy, and now scourging the entire land with water and hunger. The survivors, gaunt and hardened, rebuilt their lives on a continent littered with abandoned farms and mass graves. They had endured the worst that nature could throw at them. They had no way of knowing that the Great Famine was merely a prelude. It had thinned the herd. It had weakened the flock. It had prepared the ground for a far more efficient, far more terrifying reaper, which was at that very moment beginning a long, slow journey from the other side of the world. It was a journey that would be measured in miles, then in city blocks, and finally in heartbeats. The new pestilence did not rise from the soil or fall from the sky. It travelled, as so many things did, along the arteries of trade. Its story begins far from Europe on the vast arid plains of Central Asia. Here in the sprawling grasslands lived colonies of marmots and other rodents. And within these rodent populations, a bacterium had existed for centuries, a tiny rod-shaped organism called Yersinia pestis. In its natural reservoir, it caused occasional die-offs among the marmots, a local affair of little consequence to humanity. But the 13th century had changed the world. The rise of the Mongol Empire had for the first time politically unified the vast expanse of Eurasia from the China Sea to the borders of Poland. They had established the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a period of unprecedented stability that made long-distance travel safer than ever before. Along the network of trade routes known collectively as the Silk Road, caravans now moved with relative ease, carrying silk, spices, and porcelain from east to west. But they were also carrying unseen passengers. Sometime in the 1330s, perhaps due to climatic shifts, the plague bacterium began to move out of its isolated reservoir. It found new hosts. It found the black rat Rattus rattus, a creature perfectly adapted to living alongside humans. And on the rat, it found its perfect vehicle, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopis. The bacterium would multiply in the flea's gut, forming a blockage. Starved, the flea would bite its host with frantic aggression, regurgitating a slurry of bacterial-laden blood directly into the wound. When the rat died, the fleas, now desperate for a new warm body, would leap to the nearest available host. Often that host was a human being. The plague began to spread eastward into China, causing devastating outbreaks. But its westward journey would be the one that altered the course of history. It moved with the caravans from one oasis trading post to the next. The logistics of its spread were tied to the pace of medieval travel. It infected the rats that infested the grain sacks, the fleas that hid in the bales of cloth and fur. By the 1340s, it had reached the Mongol Khanates on the shores of the Black Sea, and it was here in the bustling cosmopolitan trading ports that it would find its way to Europe. The city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, was the critical flashpoint. In 1346, the city was under siege by the forces of Jani Beg, the Khan of the Golden Horde. As the siege dragged on, a terrible sickness broke out among the Mongol army, killing thousands and crippling their military effectiveness. In an act of what might be the earliest recorded instance of biological warfare, Jani Beg, according to the account of one Gabriel de Mussy, ordered the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers to be loaded onto catapults and flung over the city walls. The decaying bodies rained down into the besieged city, and soon the defenders of Kaffa began to sicken and die from the same horrific disease. Whether this story is entirely accurate or not is a matter of historical debate. The plague would have likely entered the city anyway, carried by the ubiquitous rats that scurried through the siege lines. But the image is a powerful one, a symbol of the pestilence being literally hurled at a terrified Europe. The Genoese merchants, seeing the city lost and their ranks being decimated by the sickness, did the only logical thing they could. They fled. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoese trading galleys cast off from the harbour at Kaffa and set sail for home. They were ghost ships, though they did not know it yet. On board, men were already incubating the disease. Below decks in the dark, warm holds, the rats were dying, and their fleas were looking for new hosts among the sailors. The ships were floating coffins, spreading the contagion at every port of call. They first stopped at Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. Within weeks, the city was engulfed by the plague. From there, the ship sailed on into the Mediterranean. In October of 1347, the 12 galleys arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The citizens of Messina looked on in horror as the ships docked. The crews were either dead or dying, their bodies covered in strange black swellings, delirious with fever and pain. The Sicilian authorities, realizing the danger, quickly ordered the fleet to leave. But it was too late. The rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas had already found new homes ashore. The great pestilence had arrived in Europe. From Sicily, the plague exploded across the sea lanes. Other infected ships from the Levant brought it to Genoa and Venice in northern Italy and to Marseilles in France around the same time in late 1347 and early 1348. The pattern was always the same. A ship would arrive. Men would sicken. And then the disease would begin its inexorable march inland. It moved at the speed of a man on foot or a cart pulled by an ox. It followed the trade routes up the rivers and along the roads from one market town to the next. The physicians of Europe were utterly helpless. Their medical knowledge, based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was useless against a bacterial pathogen. They believed the disease was caused by miasma, a poisonous vapour in the air, perhaps generated by earthquakes or the unfortunate alignment of planets. They had no concept of contagion in the modern sense, no understanding of the microscopic world of germs. What they saw was terrifying in its speed and its symptoms. The disease presented itself in primarily 3 forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. After an incubation period of a few days, the victim would experience a high fever, chills, and exhaustion. Then came the telltale sign, the bubo, a hard, painful swelling of the lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpit, or on the neck, where the flea bite had most likely occurred. These buboes could grow to the size of an apple or an orange. The skin around them would often turn black from subcutaneous hemorrhaging, giving the disease its famous name, the Black Death. Without treatment, the bubonic plague had a mortality rate of around 50 to 60%. Most died within a week. Worse still was the pneumonic form. If the bacteria reached the lungs, the disease could be transmitted directly from person to person through infected droplets in the air from a cough or a sneeze. It no longer needed the rat and the flea. The pneumonic plague caused a raging fever and coughing up of blood. Its mortality rate was effectively 100%. The third form septicemic plague was the rarest and most deadly of all. The bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, overwhelming the body's defenses. The victim would suffer a high fever, and their skin would turn dark purple or black all over. Death could occur in less than a day, sometimes before any other symptoms had even had time to develop. A person could, as the saying went, go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. By the beginning of 1348, the plague had a firm foothold on the European continent. From the great ports of Italy and France, it began its silent, unstoppable advance. It crept up the Rhone Valley. It spread through the city-states of northern Italy. It crossed the Alps into the Holy Roman Empire. It moved across France toward Paris, and it prepared to cross the Channel into England. A continent already weakened by famine. A society whose faith was already shaken now faced an enemy it could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. The intricate networks of trade and pilgrimage that had stitched medieval Christendom together were now transformed into the vectors of its own destruction. Every road, every river, every ship was a pathway for death. The bell that had once signaled the lonely exile of the leper was about to be replaced by the constant tolling dirge of the parish death bell ringing for everyone. The great pestilence had begun its work. It began, as so many final things do, with a quiet and unremarkable discomfort, a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, a headache that felt deeper than any simple malady, a sudden wave of fatigue that settled into the bones, a weariness that sleep could not touch. For the unfortunate soul in Messina or Marseille in the autumn of 1347, this was the first whisper of the end. Within a day, the whispers would become a scream. The defining symptom, the one that gave this particular pestilence its name, was the bubo. It would appear without warning, a swelling in the lymphatic centers of the body, the groin, the armpit, the neck, where the body's filters fought their desperate losing battle. At first, it was just a tender lump, but it grew with terrifying speed, becoming a hard, taut, agonizing knot of tissue the size of a hen's egg or an apple. The skin stretched over it would turn dark, a bruised purple-black, and the pain was a fire that consumed all thought. This was the bubonic form, the most common face of the great mortality. Once the bubo appeared, the victim's fate was all but sealed. A violent fever would take hold, shaking the body in great uncontrollable shivers, a desperate attempt by the internal furnace to burn away the poison. But the poison was too strong. The fever brought with it a cascade of horrors. Delirium would set in, painting vivid, terrifying pictures in the mind's eye. The victim might thrash, cry out, speak to spectres in the corner of the room. Their speech would slur. Their limbs would twitch, and then came the tokens, as they were called. Dark blotches, signs of internal bleeding would erupt across the skin, a ghastly stippling of black and purple that signaled the body's complete surrender. This was acral necrosis, the death of tissue as the circulatory system collapsed. From the first shiver to the last rattling breath, the process might take a week. Often it took only 3 or 4 days. The speed was what broke the spirit of the living. A man could be healthy at sunrise and buried by sunset of the 3rd day. It felt less like a disease and more like a divine sentence, carried out with an efficiency that was simply breathtaking. This was the work of a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, a silent passenger on the common black rat and its attendant flea, Xenocilla chaopis. The flea, its own gut blocked by the multiplying bacteria, would become frantic with hunger. It would bite a human, and in its attempt to feed, regurgitate a flood of deadly bacilli directly into the bloodstream. It was a simple, brutally effective mechanism of transmission, and it explained the plague's relentless march along the trade routes from the Black Sea ports through Constantinople across the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe. But the plague had other even more terrifying forms. Sometimes the bacteria did not settle in the lymph nodes to form a bubo. Instead, it bypassed them and invaded the lungs. This was the pneumonic plague. It was a different kind of killer. The fever was just as high, the weakness just as profound, but the primary symptom was a racking cough. The victim would gasp for air, their chest filled with a bloody frothing liquid. Each cough would aerosolize the bacteria, sending a fine, invisible mist of death into the air. Anyone who breathed it in was infected. This form needed no rats, no fleas. It passed directly from person to person through a shared breath in a crowded hovel, a whispered confession, a final kiss. The pneumonic plague was even faster than the bubonic. Death was almost a certainty, often coming within 1 or 2 days. It was this form that turned cities into sealed tombs, as the very air between people became a weapon. And then there was the third of the rarest and most lethal of the Trinity, septicemic plague. In these cases, the bacteria overwhelmed the body's defenses immediately, flooding the bloodstream in a massive, unstoppable tide. There was no time for a bubo to form. There was often no cough. There was only a sudden catastrophic collapse, a raging fever, extreme chills, abdominal pain, shock and bleeding from every orifice. The victim's skin would turn dark, almost black as the blood vessels hemorrhaged and the tissue died. They would die in agony, often in less than 24 hours from the first sign of illness. This was the truest Black Death, a form so swift and so horrifying that it seemed to be a direct manifestation of God's wrath, a scourge that offered no chance of appeal, no time for prayer. It was the sight of a neighbour, hale and hearty in the morning, turning into a blackened corpse by dusk that shattered the medieval mind. The sheer clinical horror of the symptoms, the speed, the inevitability, was the engine of the chaos that was to come. For how do you govern a world where death is not just a visitor but the new king? In the face of this incomprehensible, implacable enemy, the delicate threads that held society together did not merely fray, they snapped. The first casualty was order abandoned in a headlong flight of raw animal panic. Those who had the means fled. In Florence, as Giovanni Boccaccio would later immortalize in his Decameron, the wealthy sealed up their city palazzos and escaped to their airy villas in the countryside, hoping to outrun the tainted air, the miasma that they believed carried the sickness. They left behind a city descending into hell. Doctors sworn to heal refused to visit the sick, their medical learning useless against an enemy they could not see or understand. Priests, the shepherds of the soul, locked their church doors, terrified of hearing the last confession of a plague victim and breathing in their final fatal breath. Notaries would not venture out to witness last wills and testaments, leaving inheritances and properties in a state of utter confusion. The very mechanisms of civilized life, law, faith, medicine, ground to a halt. Family, the bedrock of medieval society, crumbled under the strain. Boccaccio wrote with an eyewitness's despair of the terrible reality. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, sister by brother, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. The house that showed the first sign of sickness was a house condemned. Neighbours would seal the doors from the outside, trapping the healthy with the dying. The bonds of love and duty stretched to their breaking point, simply gave way to the primal instinct for self-preservation. The streets of the great cities, Paris, London, Siena, grew unnervingly quiet, punctuated only by the rumble of the death carts making their grim rounds. The gravediggers, the bacchini in Italy, became the new lords of the city. They were often the dregs of society, criminals and outcasts, but now they held the power of life and death. They charged extortionate rates to carry away the dead, and if a family could not pay, the body was left to rot where it lay. They looted the homes of the dead and dying with impunity. Who was left to stop them? The city guard was decimated. The magistrates were in hiding. In this vacuum of authority and explanation, extreme ideologies festered. If the church could offer no solace, no protection, then people would seek their own salvation. From the German lands, a strange and terrifying movement arose, the flagellants. They marched from town to town in long, solemn processions, their faces hidden by hoods, their backs bared to the sky. They moved in a disciplined, almost military fashion, carrying crosses and banners, chanting hymns of penitence. Twice a day and once at night, they would perform their ritual. In the town square, they would form a circle and throw themselves to the ground, prostrating themselves in the shape of a cross. Then, at the signal of their master, they would rise and begin to scourge themselves and each other with brutal leather whips tipped with iron studs. The rhythmic wet slap of leather on skin echoed through the silent squares, a horrifying sound of mass penance. They whipped themselves until their backs were a bloody pulp, believing their own suffering could atone for the sins of mankind and persuade God to lift the plague. At first, the flagellants were welcomed as heroes, as true saints walking the earth. The townspeople would watch in awe, weeping at their piety, dipping cloths in their blood to keep as holy relics. But their movement carried a dangerous seed of rebellion. They claimed a direct line to God, bypassing the authority of the priests and bishops who were hiding in their palaces. They developed their own rites, their own theology, and they preached a radical apocalyptic message. And as they marched, their fervor often curdled into violence. Looking for a terrestrial cause for God's divine anger, they found an easy target. They became the vanguard of a new and horrifying wave of anti-Semitic persecution. The scapegoating of Europe's Jewish communities was the darkest stain on an already blackened age. The old ugly libels were revived and given new life by the plague. Rumors flew across the continent, spreading faster than the pestilence itself, that the Jews were poisoning the wells and springs to destroy Christendom. The logic was perverse, but to a terrified and ignorant populace, utterly compelling. Jewish communities, often living in segregated ghettos with their own water sources and stricter dietary and sanitary laws, sometimes had lower mortality rates. This was not seen as a result of hygiene, but as proof of their guilt. Why else would they be spared? The flagellant preachers fanned the flames, declaring that the plague would not end until the last of the Christ killers was exterminated. The result was a series of pogroms of unimaginable brutality. In 1348, the Jewish communities of Provence and Savoy were attacked in Basel, Switzerland. The entire Jewish population was rounded up and burned alive in a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine. The great Jewish communities of the Rhineland were annihilated in Strasbourg. In February 1349, even before the plague had reached the city, the town guilds, fearing economic competition and eager to have their debts cancelled, overthrew the city council that had tried to protect the Jews. 2,000 men, women and children were taken to the Jewish cemetery, herded into a massive wooden pyre and burned. Their property was seized, their records of loans destroyed. Pope Clement VI, residing in Avignon, issued 2 papal bulls condemning the violence and pointing out the obvious, that Jews were dying of the plague just like Christians, and that the plague was rampant in lands where no Jews lived. A few rulers like Duke Albert, the head of Austria, made genuine efforts to protect their Jewish subjects, but their voices of reason were drowned out by a tide of hysterical fear and murderous greed. The social order had not just broken down, it had inverted, turning neighbours into murderers and piety into a justification for slaughter. The world was not just dying, it was tearing itself apart. But even as Europe tore itself apart from within, consumed by a microscopic foe, the older, more familiar forms of destruction continued their grim work. The 14th century was not an age of peace interrupted by plague. It was an age of incessant warfare upon which the plague was merely the most terrible layer. The great conflict of the era, the 100 Years' War between England and France, had begun in 1337 and would grind on long after the first wave of the Black Death had receded. For the common person, war was just another season, as predictable and as devastating as a bad harvest. It was a constant source of misery, a relentless engine of injury, infection, and death that operated entirely independently of Yersinia pestis. The death it delivered was not swift and feverish, but brutal, bloody, and intensely personal. To understand death in medieval battle is to understand the physics of the weapons used. This was not the remote, anonymous killing of later centuries. This was an intimate, visceral business. Consider the iconic weapon of the age, the English longbow. In the hands of a trained yeoman, this 6-foot stave of yew could unleash 10 to 12 arrows a minute, a storm of steel-tipped shafts that could travel over 200 yards. At battles like Crécy in 1346, French knights charged into a dark sky full of these projectiles. An arrow did not just pierce, it tore. The most feared arrowhead was the bodkin, a long, slender, squared-off point designed not to cut, but to punch through the links of a mail hauberk, or find the thin gap in a suit of plate armour. If it struck an unarmoured man or a horse, it could pass clean through. The wound was a deep, ragged puncture, and extracting the arrow was a nightmare. The head was often barbed, designed to catch on muscle and bone, ensuring that any attempt to pull it out would only inflict greater damage. Specialised arrow spoons were sometimes used by surgeons to try and work the head free, but this was agonising work performed on a screaming man without anaesthesia. More often, the shaft was simply broken off, leaving the steel head buried deep in the body, a fatal seed of infection. For those who survived the arrow storm and closed for hand-to-hand combat, a different kind of horror awaited. Blunt force trauma was a specialty of the medieval battlefield. A knight on horseback wielding a heavy mace or a warhammer was not trying to fence. He was trying to crush. The flanged head of a mace was designed to concentrate an immense amount of force onto a small area, shattering bone and denting the thickest plate helm. A blow to the head, even if it didn't breach the helmet, could cause a catastrophic concussion, swelling of the brain, or a skull fracture beneath the steel. A man could be killed without ever shedding a drop of blood externally. Pole arms, like the halberd or the poleaxe, combined the functions of a spear, an axe, and a hook. They could be used to thrust, to chop, or to pull a knight from his horse. The axe blade of a halberd could split a helmet, cleave through a shoulder, or sever a limb with a single devastating blow. A sword cut, while perhaps cleaner, was no less deadly, capable of opening a man from neck to navel or shearing off a hand at the wrist. Yet the initial wound, horrific as it was often just the prelude. The true killer on the medieval battlefield was infection. The concept of germ theory was centuries away. A soldier's understanding of hygiene was, to be generous, rudimentary. The battlefield itself was a quagmire of mud, blood, and excrement. A man who fell with an open wound was essentially being dipped in a septic soup. The surgeons who followed the army were more butchers than doctors. Their instruments were unsterilized, wiped clean on a dirty rag between patients if they were lucky. Their methods were brutal and based on ancient flawed theories. The standard treatment for a deep wound was cauterization. A poker, or the flat of a sword blade, would be heated in a fire until it glowed red, and then pressed directly into the wound to seal the blood vessels. The smoke, the smell of burning flesh, and the shriek of the patient were common features of any post-battle camp. For wounds that could not be cauterized, surgeons would pack them with whatever was at hand, cobwebs, moss, even animal dung, believing these substances had healing properties. In reality, they were simply introducing a host of new bacteria directly into the body. The results were predictable and ghastly. Gangrene would set in the tissue, turning black and putrid, releasing a foul stench as it decayed. Tetanus or lockjaw would cause agonizing muscle spasms, arching the victim's back until their spine snapped. But the most common killer was sepsis, a rampant body-wide infection that turned the blood to poison. A simple puncture wound in the thigh from a peasant's spear could in a matter of days lead to a raging fever, delirium, and a slow, agonizing death. Amputation was the only hope for a gangrenous limb, a terrifying procedure involving a saw, a strong stomach, and several men to hold the patient down. Survival was rare for the common soldier. A serious wound was almost invariably a death sentence. And the horror of medieval warfare was not confined to the battlefield. In fact, the majority of its victims were not soldiers at all, but the civilians caught in its path. The defining feature of medieval strategy was the siege. Capturing a fortified town or castle was essential for controlling territory. But frontal assaults were costly and dangerous. The preferred method was to surround a town, cut off its supply lines, and simply starve it into submission. A siege was a slow, deliberate act of collective murder. For the people trapped inside the walls, men, women, children, the elderly, it was a descent into a living nightmare. The process began with the devastation of the surrounding countryside. The besieging army would engage in a chevauchée, a systematic campaign of terror and destruction, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and poisoning wells to ensure that no aid could reach the town from the outside. Then they would settle in for the long wait. As the weeks turned into months, the food supplies within the walls would dwindle. Rations would be cut again and again. The price of a loaf of bread would skyrocket. Soon, the people would be eating their horses, then their dogs and cats, then the rats in the sewers. Leather boots and belts would be boiled for what little sustenance they could provide. Malnutrition would give way to starvation. Disease, particularly dysentery from contaminated water, would run rampant. The besieging army would add psychological torment to the physical suffering. Great siege engines like the mighty trebuchet would hurl not only massive stones to smash the walls, but also a more grotesque ammunition. The rotting carcasses of horses and cattle would be flung into the town to spread disease. The heads of captured messengers or slain defenders would be launched over the ramparts. A grim message to the survivors. The fall of a town when it finally came was often the worst part. If the defenders had refused terms of surrender, the laws of war permitted the victorious army to sack the city. This was a license for unrestrained brutality. Soldiers who had been camped for months would be unleashed upon the starving, weakened population. The sack of Limoges in 1370, ordered by the English commander Edward the Black Prince, was a chilling example. His soldiers stormed the city, and by the account of the chronicler, Jean Froissart slaughtered over 3,000 men, women, and children who had taken refuge in the cathedral, a massacre of the innocent that shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the 14th century. This was the reality of war, a grinding, dirty, and profoundly cruel business where death by the sword was a mercy compared to the slow agony of starvation inside a besieged town or the festering poison of an untended wound. It was the world the plague found, a world already intimately acquainted with death in all its forms. To live in the medieval world was to be intimately acquainted with the process of dying. It was not a sterile hidden event, but a public ritualized and profoundly important performance. For the vast majority, the greatest terror was not death itself, but the prospect of a bad death, a sudden end, an unprepared soul cast into the void without the proper guidance. And so, in the later Middle Ages, particularly after the great pestilence had taught everyone the precarity of breath, a whole culture and art form evolved around this final act. They called it the ars moriendi, the art of dying. This was not merely a concept, it was a genre of literature, devotional texts complete with stark woodcut illustrations that served as a practical guide for the soul's most critical journey. Imagine a small wattle and daub house in the 15th century. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and the faint, sweet smell of sickness. In the center of the room, on a simple straw-filled mattress, lies the dying man. He's not alone. His family crowds close, their faces illuminated by a single tallow candle, their whispered prayers a constant rhythmic drone. This is not a moment of private grief, but a communal vigil. The neighbors are here too, standing in the doorway, their presence a testament to the shared understanding of this ritual. They are all here to bear witness, to help the departing soul, and to learn. For every deathbed was a classroom. The true guest of honor, however, is yet to arrive. He is the parish priest, summoned from his church, perhaps miles away. His journey is a small procession in itself. He carries the Blessed Sacrament in a vessel called a pyx, protected from the elements, often with a small bell rung before him to announce the passing of the Lord and to clear a path. When he enters the darkened room, a space is cleared. The air shifts. This is the arrival of the logistics expert for the afterlife. His task is to ensure the soul is properly prepared, its paperwork in order for its appearance before the ultimate authority. The process begins with the final confession. This is the great accounting. The priest leans close, his ear next to the dying man's lips, listening to the whispered litany of a lifetime's sins. Envy, a stolen chicken, a lie told in anger, a failure of faith. The sacrament of penance was the washing of the soul, an attempt to wipe the slate as clean as possible before the final judgment. The Ars Moriendi texts would depict this moment vividly. In the illustrations, you can see demons hovering near the bed, whispering temptations into the dying man's ear, reminding him of his past failings, urging him to despair. Opposite them, angels offer encouragement, reminding him of God's infinite mercy. The priest was the earthly arbiter in this supernatural struggle, his words of absolution a shield against the forces of damnation. Next came the viaticum. The word itself means food for the journey. This was the final Eucharist, the consecrated host placed upon the dying tongue. It was the spiritual sustenance for the soul's arduous passage from the world of the living to the world of the dead. It was an act of profound intimacy and hope, a final communion with the divine before stepping into its presence. And lastly, there was extreme unction, the anointing of the sick. The priest would dip his thumb in holy oil and trace the sign of the cross on the dying person's senses. The eyes that had looked upon vanity, the ears that had heard gossip, the lips that had spoken falsehoods, the hands that had sinned, the feet that had walked astray. It was a final purification, a spiritual sealing of the body to fortify the soul for the final struggle. To receive these three sacraments, penance, viaticum, and unction, was to have a good death. It meant you had faced your end with courage, piety, and preparation. You had put your affairs in order, both earthly and spiritual. You had died in a state of grace. This ideal was so powerful that the fear of its opposite was a constant gnawing anxiety in the medieval mind. The horror of a sudden unprovided for death was immense. To be struck by lightning in a field, to fall from a horse on a lonely road, to be stabbed in a tavern brawl, or worse, to be carried off by the plague so quickly that the priest could not arrive in time. This was to be ambushed by eternity. It meant no confession, no absolution, no final communion. It meant facing judgment with the full weight of your sins still upon you. This fear fueled the cult of saints like St. Christopher, the patron of travelers, whose image was painted on church walls so that a mere glance upon it was thought to protect a person from a sudden death that day. It was a small insurance policy against the ultimate spiritual catastrophe. The good death was the final chapter of a life lived in faith. A bad death was a terrifying epilogue of eternal uncertainty. But what happens when death is not a single ordered departure in a quiet room, but a tempest that rips the roof off the world? What happens when it is not one soul's journey, but the journey of millions all at once? The Black Death of the mid-14th century and the recurring waves of plague that followed did not just end lives. They ended a way of life. The meticulous rituals of the Ars Moriendi collapsed under the sheer logistical weight of the dying. Priests themselves succumbing at an alarming rate could not keep up. The dead were bundled into mass graves, their passing unrecorded, their souls sent on their way with only the briefest of collective prayers. The world that the survivors inherited was silent, empty, and irrevocably changed. The aftermath of the Great Mortality was not a return to normalcy, but the birth of a strange and unfamiliar new era, one built upon the bones of the old. Before the plague, the fundamental structure of society, particularly in a place like England or France, was based on a simple, brutal equation: a vast supply of people and a limited supply of land. This made land valuable and people cheap. The majority of the population were serfs, legally bound to the manor of their lord. They were not slaves who could be bought and sold, but they were not free. They could not leave the land, marry, or even have their grain milled without the lord's permission. In return for a small plot to cultivate for their own survival, they owed their lord labour, days spent ploughing his fields, reaping his harvests, and maintaining his estate. This was the engine of the feudal economy, a system designed to extract wealth from a captive and abundant workforce. Then came the Yersinia pestis. In the space of a few years, from 1347 to 1351, it scythed through Europe, killing somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population. The fundamental equation was violently inverted. Suddenly, there was an abundance of land and a catastrophic shortage of people. For the first time in centuries, the most valuable commodity in Europe was a single healthy labourer. The change was not immediate, but it was relentless. A lord of a manor in Kent who once had 100 families to work his lands might now have only 50. His neighbour 5 miles down the road faced the same problem. For the surviving peasant, this was a moment of stunning, unprecedented leverage. If his lord demanded the same old labour services, the peasant could now do the unthinkable. He could leave. He could walk to the next manor, where a desperate lord might offer him better terms, perhaps freedom from labour service entirely in exchange for a simple cash rent. He might even be offered a wage to work the lord's own fields, a wage that climbed higher and higher as landowners competed for a dwindling pool of workers. The ruling class was horrified. Their world was turning upside down. The natural order which had placed them at the top and the peasant at the bottom was cracking. In England, the establishment tried to fight back. In 1351, King Edward III enacted the Statute of Labourers, a piece of legislation born of pure panic. It attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, forbade labourers from leaving their parish in search of better pay, and made it illegal for lords to offer more than the old rates. It was a spectacular failure. The law was simply unenforceable. You could not legislate away the basic economic reality of supply and demand. Local courts were flooded with cases, but the peasants kept moving, and the lords, desperate to get their harvests in before they rotted in the fields, kept quietly breaking the law and paying the higher wages. Slowly, inexorably, the chains of serfdom dissolved. The old system of labour dues gave way to a new one of cash rents. Peasants became tenants, paying their lord for the use of the land, but otherwise free to manage their own affairs and sell their surplus produce at market. This was a seismic shift. It marked the beginning of the end for the feudal manorial system and the slow birth of a more modern market-based agricultural economy. For the survivors, the material benefits were tangible. With more land available per person, diets improved. There was more land for grazing, which meant more meat and dairy. Wages for artisans in the cities also skyrocketed. A skilled carpenter or mason could command a premium for his services. For a brief period, perhaps a century or so after the Black Death, the common labourer of England enjoyed a standard of living measured in purchasing power and nutrition that they would not see again until the 19th century. It was a strange, grim golden age born from the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history. This newfound economic power and social mobility bred a new kind of confidence, and with it a new willingness to challenge the old authorities. When governments like that of the young Richard II in England tried to impose new taxes, such as the deeply unpopular poll tax of 1380 to fund foreign wars, the reaction was explosive. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was not a disorganized riot of the starving. There was a highly organized insurrection led by men like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, who preached a revolutionary sermon with the famous line, "When Adam delved, and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Their demands were explicitly political: an end to all vestiges of serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and a radical restructuring of the social order. They marched on London, captured the Tower, and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King's Treasurer. Although the revolt was eventually crushed and its leaders executed, it sent a shockwave through the English aristocracy. The peasants had demonstrated their collective power. They had tasted a measure of freedom, and they would not easily be forced back into the old ways. Similar uprisings like the Jacquerie in France flared across Europe. The old feudal contract had been broken by the plague, and no amount of legislation or force could fully restore it. Power, once concentrated entirely in the hands of a land-owning military elite, had begun to diffuse downwards, a slow, grudging, but irreversible transfer that would reshape the political landscape of the continent. This new world forged in the crucible of mass death did not and could not erase the memory of its birth. The economic and social transformations were profound, but they unfolded against a backdrop of deep psychological trauma. The spectre of mortality, having demonstrated its awesome power so convincingly, now lingered in every corner of the medieval mind, coloring every aspect of life, art, and faith. To understand the medieval mindset, one must first understand that their relationship with death was not one of distant acquaintance, but of daily suffocating intimacy. The raw numbers are difficult for us to comprehend. Life expectancy at birth hovered somewhere in the early 30s. This grim average, however, conceals a more brutal reality. It wasn't that most people dropped dead at 35. It was that a staggering number never even made it to 5. Infant and child mortality was appallingly high. A woman might give birth to 8 children and be fortunate if 3 survived to adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, and minor infections that we would dismiss with a course of antibiotics were all potential death sentences. To reach the age of 50 was to be considered truly old. A survivor who had weathered countless storms and outlived spouses, siblings, and a heartbreaking number of their own children. This wasn't a statistical abstraction. It was the lived experience of nearly everyone. The world was a fabric woven with threads of grief. This ever-present reality of an early, often painful and arbitrary death shaped the collective consciousness in deep and contradictory ways. For many, it fostered a profound sense of fatalism, a belief that one's life was fragile and ultimately in the hands of a remote and inscrutable God. This life on earth was seen as little more than a brief, painful pilgrimage, a testing ground for the soul before it entered the true eternal life that lay beyond the grave. This worldview naturally reinforced the power of the Church, the only institution that claimed to hold the keys to that eternal kingdom. The intense focus on piety, the purchase of indulgences to shorten time in purgatory, the veneration of saintly relics, the arduous journeys to pilgrimage sites like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, all can be seen as desperate attempts to exert some small measure of control over one's eternal destiny. Since control over one's earthly existence was so obviously an illusion, yet this piety existed alongside its polar opposite, a raw carpe diem hedonism. If life was short and unpredictable, why not enjoy its fleeting pleasures? Giovanni Boccaccio, writing his Decameron in the immediate aftermath of the plague's first wave in Florence, perfectly captures this impulse. His characters, a group of young nobles, do not respond to the horror by flagellating themselves in prayer. They retreat to a country villa to feast, drink wine, and tell scandalous stories. It was a defiant assertion of life in the face of overwhelming death. This tension between fervent piety and worldly indulgence was not a contradiction to be resolved, but the central defining duality of the late medieval mindset. Nowhere is this obsession with mortality more visible than in the art of the period. The theme of memento mori, remember you must die, became pervasive in portraits of wealthy merchants and powerful dukes. Small skulls might be placed discreetly on a windowsill, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that earthly power and riches are temporary. A more dramatic expression was the artistic motif known as the three living and the three dead. In these paintings and manuscript illuminations, three young, arrogant noblemen out hunting stumble upon three decaying corpses, their own future selves, who warn them, "As you are, we once were; as we are, you will be." It was a stark, moralizing lesson on the vanity of worldly pride. Even more potent was the imagery of the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. First appearing as a mural in the Holy Innocents Cemetery in Paris in the 1420s, the theme exploded in popularity across Europe, reproduced in woodcuts that could be printed and widely distributed. The images are both grim and strangely democratic. A skeletal figure representing death is shown gleefully leading a procession of mortals to their doom. But the procession is a cross-section of the entire social order. Death grabs the hand of the Pope in his finery, the emperor with his crown, the knight with his armor, the wealthy burgher with his money bags, the beautiful maiden, the humble peasant, and even the tiny infant. The message was brutally clear and in its own way subversive. Death is the great equalizer. It respects no rank, no wealth, no power. Before the finality of the grave, all are made equal. This preoccupation even extended to the very tombs of the powerful. The 15th century saw the rise of the transy tomb. A nobleman like Cardinal Jean de Lagrange might have a traditional effigy on top of his sarcophagus, depicting him in the full glorious regalia of his office. But below it on a lower level would be another sculpture, a shockingly realistic effigy of his naked, decaying corpse, emaciated and ravaged by worms. It was the ultimate statement of memento mori, a permanent stone reminder of the vile physical reality that awaited everyone, no matter how powerful. The body would decay, but the soul, if properly prepared, would endure. This was the central, urgent focus. Life in the medieval world was a constant negotiation with death. It was the low, persistent hum beneath the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the cry of the market trader, and the chant of the monk. It informed the farmer's prayer for a good harvest, the lord's quest for dynastic security, and the artist's meditation on the fleeting nature of beauty. The nearness of their end did not necessarily make them morbidly depressed. Rather, it gave their world a different kind of intensity. It imbued their faith with a desperate urgency, their social hierarchies with a grim irony, and their moments of joy with a poignant, fragile beauty. They lived, loved, fought, and built their cathedrals to scrape the heavens, all under the vast, unblinking gaze of a skull, forever aware that their time on this earth was a brief and precious flicker in the great dark expanse of eternity.